Hey everyone, it's Pojo back with another short little vlog that we're recording to fill our vacation hours in the hour or two before we have to start packing. So we are going to be talking a little bit about priority and opportunity, or particularly fast spells. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about basically Eternal's very unusual emergent design, I would say, is probably the appropriate word. And we're going to be talking about sort of how that has affected the gameplay of Eternal, what you can sort of do with information and opportunity in this game, and also we're going to end this out with a small plea to Direwolf Digital, because this is something that I have been asking about for a while, but I'm always going to be talking about it a little bit more. Okay, but first things first, fast spells. So, in a game of physical cards, there are a number of different things that you can use to determine what is in an opponent's hand. There is the probability that they draw the card based on your knowledge of their deck. There is the cards that they have played and what kind of strategy that indicates. So there's a lot of instinct and intuition based on just what you have seen and your memory and knowledge of what is going on in the deck. The final thing that is often used is reading your opponent, looking them directly in the eyes and sort of basically trying to suss out whether or not they're holding that instant speed card or whether or not they have a bunch of lands in their hand. That kind of information is something that you can't convey over a digital space, at least not to a significant extent, but most digital card games do have some means of at least projecting a little bit of information. So for example, in both Hearthstone and Eternal, when you are mousing over a card to look at it, the card lights up, so you know that your opponent is looking at a particular card or maybe even considering targeting it with a card. Something that Eternal does that is very unique is Eternal is one of the few games that manages priority really well. It has a limited amount of priority passes, but it does allow you to swap priority passes back and forth between opponents, meaning that when an attack is made, you have the opportunity to play fast spells. And when you have the opportunity to play fast spells, if you have a fast spell in your hand, the priority passes to you, and you can then pass it back without playing the fast spell. When you do that, however, it creates a small pause. So your opponent will attack. They will attack into, say, a board full of nothing, and they'll notice a small pause before the attack executes due to the fact that you were offered a priority pass, and then you pressed end turn or pass back, and you gave them the priority back. If you don't have the spell in hand that can affect the unit, for example, if your opponent is attacking you with a Milos Rebel Bomber and you have an Annihilate in hand, then you will get a pause. But if you don't have an Annihilate in hand, if you don't have a fast spell that functions, the Milos Rebel Bomber will attack and there will not be a pause. As a result, doing attacks, casting spells, and doing other actions that cause priority passes to happen while you have power open offers your opponent information about what is in your hand, much in the same way that reading someone's face in a game of Magic might offer some information about what they're doing. In addition, in Magic, if you are doing something, your opponent might say, "Hey, wait," and then decide whether or not they want to play a card in their hand. That's exactly what's happening here, except it's non-optional. This is a facial tick that cannot be removed. It is a part of the information and a totality of the information in this game. So you get this information as long as particular requirements are fulfilled, and you can also hide this information in certain ways. This is really a very interesting aspect of Eternal, and I wanted to talk about some of the basic strategy behind it, because it actually makes for some really interesting change-ups in how you might play the game as compared to a game of Magic. For example, in a game of Magic, there are two main phases. You play your cards first, you do your attacks, and then you play more cards afterwards. And frequently in Magic, it is almost always better to play in the second main phase. You want to do your attacks, figure out what happens, and then afterwards, after you have sort of gotten a better idea of what's going on board and denied your opponent information about what's in your hand, you can then play the cards in your hand afterwards. So for example, if you have a big 3-drop and you want to attack into a trade, your opponent might, or if you have like a good drop that's available on turn and you want to attack into a possible trade and you want your opponent to trade, but if your opponent knows that card is on the board, they're not going to trade. You can attack first, then sort of play the card. With Eternal, there's a reason to play that card first, which is that when you play that card, you remove the power that you used to play the card. So, say again that you have an Annihilate and a Milos Rebel Bomber in your hand. You play the Milos Rebel Bomber, you attack in, and then your opponent gets to block. Your opponent blocks, and because you no longer have the power for the Annihilate does not show a pause. The priority does not pass. That means that you are hiding information by playing cards earlier in the turn, as opposed to hiding information by playing cards later in the turn. In addition, spending your power on turns where you are certain not to want to play a fast spell just generally allows you to hide what kind of power is being played and hide that information from your opponent. Generally, denying information to your opponent is a really good thing. Of course, it is also a good thing to play as much power as possible and to play all of your cards on good tempo most of the time. There's definitely a variety of different situations where this is a good thing to do, and a variety of different situations where it's a bad thing to do. It's not necessarily correct one way or the other. You don't want to always play your cards first. You don't want to always play your cards second. But if you see someone playing a unit and then making an attack, they may be trying to bluff you and basically hide the fact that they have a fast spell that they don't want to play just yet. That's something really important to pay attention to. So that's like a really interesting aspect of information in Eternal, and it's something you should consider in your strategies. Something else that you can consider in your strategies that's really very interesting is that this game does in fact have slightly different rules for priority passes based on your settings. So this is something that you might want to pay attention to if you haven't seen this before. I believe that many people will recommend this to you if this is your first time, you might not know about it. So in the gameplay features, there's a function that says Smart Auto Pass, which says automatically continue when you have no relevant actions. Most of the time, it's fine to have this on. Basically, all it does is it says, like, hey, at the end of your opponent's turn, you have the only unit on board and you have a torch in hand. You can torch your own unit. Sorry, not a torch. Torch is not fast anymore. Once again, we'll go with Annihilate. At the end of your turn, you have an Annihilate in hand. You can annihilate your own unit, but your opponent doesn't have any units to annihilate, and the game knows that you probably don't want to annihilate your own unit, so it'll just skip that priority pass. But if you have Smart Auto Pass off, then you will get a priority pass on the turn where your opponent passes turns. So even though they go to the end of the turn, you'll still get the opportunity to play the Annihilate. That means that on the one hand, you are providing your opponent with more information about what's in your hand. It tells your opponent that you have a 2-cost fast spell that they may not have seen the priority pass for before. They may not have seen that pause. On the other hand, not having Smart Auto Pass on means that you are denied the opportunity to play spells in certain unique configurations. So, for example, annihilating your own unit or devouring your own unit not necessarily devouring, because devour can always target your own units, but say annihilating your own unit in response to a lifesteal trigger might be something that could happen. Say someone plays at any cost on a unit and you have an Annihilate in your hand, you can play Annihilate to kill your own unit, and then the at any cost will not lifesteal and gain a bunch of health. That's kind of an important bit of like gameplay, and depending on what kind of cards you have, Smart Auto Pass may be better on or off. Most people leave it off if they are playing professionally, but you could potentially turn it on if you have a deck full of cards where that information and hiding that information is actually very important to you. This is just like a piece of strategy that is both like very, very complicated, like so much so that you will basically never see people use this, but also like very, very simple. And it's a question of whether or not you want that on or off. As just a general strategy overall. In general, if you're playing just basically, you can just leave this on. The basically missing all of these priority passes, not having to click the end button as often is actually totally fine. It doesn't lose you as many games as you would expect, and it will save you a lot of time in the long run if you play 100 to 1,000 games. But most of the time, if you're trying to become like a professional player, we tend to recommend that you turn this off. But that's Smart Auto Pass, so something that you may or may not have known, and also some discussion of how it can be used tactically in an advanced setting. All right, we're up on about 10 minutes, and I'm trying to keep these ones relatively short. So the last thing that I want to talk about, this is emergent design. This is something that came about probably directly as a result of implementing priority passes into Eternal, but that the developers decided was worth keeping. Like, if you have talked to developers about it, they have generally indicated that this is something that is not accidental. This is a deliberate piece of decision making. This is information and strategy that is deliberately injected into the game as a result, perhaps, of the game's design, but definitely intentionally and somewhat effectively used. It provides a lot of the interesting bluff mechanics in the game, and it is something that actually should be used. To that extent, I have one request, which is that priority passes be indicated somehow visually. I really don't like that this game indicates priority pass through a small millisecond pause. It's something that even after many, many hours in this game, I mean, I think I've said that I've played around 10,000, I still don't always see the priority pass. I don't see it. And like, I don't think that the sort of visual indicator is strong enough. I think that that information is something that every player should be playing with, but that every player can't necessarily see, and that isn't necessarily a learned skill. I think it's something that actually is a bit of an accessibility issue in terms of determining like whether or not this is something that you will actively notice in the course of a game. I think that it should have a visual representation that you can see in replays and that you can see in other functions where you know that your opponent has priority pass just through like a small coin marker or like some sort of like just little flasher indicator that says, yes, there was a priority pass here. Use that information how you will. If this is indeed emergent design, which it absolutely is, I think that it should be supported by Eternal UI, and that's my general opinion on the matter. All right, that's me. Thank you so much for watching. I'm on YouTube, Patreon, Twitch, and Twitter, and you can subscribe to me in any of those places and find out more information about Eternal. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll be back with a couple more of these before we are back playing some games.